Hi, I'm Deacon Shant Kazanjian. With the blessings of His Eminence Archbishop Anushavan Tanyelian, we are starting a mini course on baptism. Baptism is the foundation of our life in Christ. It marks the beginning of our life in the church. I'd like to begin this series with a brief reflection on one of the Bible readings that we do during the celebration of baptism in the Armenian Christian tradition, St. Paul's letter to the Galatians. This letter is probably one of the earliest New Testament documents that we have, written around the middle of the first century. In chapter 3, verses 26 and following, St. Paul says, "For in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise." Now, there is so much here to unpack, but I'd like to highlight a few points. For St. Paul, there's a direct link between being children of God and being in Christ. We should note that Christ is not just a proper name. It also means the anointed one, the Messiah. So to be in Christ, to be in the Messiah, to make a long story short, is to be part of Messiah's community, part of Messiah's family. In other words, to be part of God's people. And how does one join the Messiah's family? The next verse explains it. Verse 27, Paul says, "As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ." The verb to baptize, baptizo, means to immerse. Now, to be baptized into Christ is to be plunged into Messiah's community. Baptism is the doorway. And the result of that is that one comes to be in the Messiah. And all those who are baptized into Christ, Paul says, have put on Christ. Paul is using the metaphor of clothing to describe what happens at baptism. The metaphor is probably influenced by the ceremony itself. As one enters the baptismal waters, the old garments are removed, and after baptism, one puts on new clothes, signifying the new identity they now have. And that identity is none other than Christ himself. They have put on Christ. That is the basic meaning of baptism here. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to that last verse, verse 29, where Paul says, "If you belong to Christ," which is sometimes translated as "if you are Christ" or "if you are of Christ." That same phrase in New Testament Greek, "to be Christ" or "of Christ," is expressed slightly differently in classical Armenian in a number of places, but with the same basic meaning. For instance, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 12, Paul writes regarding divisions in the community, saying, "Each one of you says, 'I belong to Paul,' or 'I belong to Apollos,' or 'I belong to Christ.'" Now, when we read this in classical Armenian, it says, each one of you says, "I belong to Paul, yes, Bogosianem," or "I belong to Apollos, Abogosian," or "I belong to Christ, Christosian." Clearly, this implies that we have people belonging to this or that group or community with its leader. So all those who are in Christ, who are part of Messiah's family, belong to Christ. That is, they are Christosian. So through baptism, we are brought into the Messiah's family. In Christ, we are children of God. We belong to Him and we are defined by Him. That is our basic Christian identity. So whether we are Bedrosian or Bogosian or Hagopian, when we are baptized, we become Christosian. Well, much more we can say here, but in the coming weeks, we are going to explore the meaning of baptism in bite-sized presentations. We will put baptism in the context of the much larger story of the Bible. We will take a bird's eye view of the service of baptism, its overall structure, highlighting its main features. We will then move through the service section by section. We will zoom in here and there a bit and explore some of the details. So I hope you join us. See you soon.